Welcome to my channel. Subscribe to the channel and listen to my stories every day. I still remember how ordinary that Friday morning felt before everything changed. It was early, just past dawn, and I was sitting in the kitchen, scrolling through my emails with a mug of coffee. The house was quiet, and I could hear my wife, Rebecca, moving around upstairs. Our 9-year marriage had settled into a comfortable routine. We weren't the kind of couple who held hands in public anymore, but we shared a quiet understanding. Or so I thought. Rebecca came down with a bag slung over her shoulder, one I didn't recognize. She poured herself a quick coffee, avoiding my gaze, and then, in a voice as casual as if she were mentioning the weather, she announced, "I'm heading out tonight with friends. I'll probably stay over." I looked up, a bit thrown by her tone. "Friends?" I echoed, trying to remember the last time she'd had a girls' night that didn't end with her home by midnight. The idea of her staying out was unexpected, and something in her eyes seemed off. She gave me a practiced smile. "Yeah, a few of us decided we needed a break," she said, brushing it off like it was no big deal. "Don't wait up." Her fingers played with the strap on her shoulder, gripping it too tight. "Okay," I said, nodding slowly, but I was watching her closely. "Who are you meeting?" For a split second, she froze, like a deer caught in headlights, before recovering. "Just, some friends from work." She forced a laugh. "You don't know them, don't worry." But I did worry. As she turned to leave, I noticed the little tells that come from living with someone for almost a decade. The way her eyes avoided mine, the faint twitch in her lips as she forced that casual grin. These things were small, almost invisible, but to someone who knew her as well as I did, they were bright red flags. The rest of the day passed in a strange fog. I tried to focus on work, but my thoughts kept circling back to that morning. By evening, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She'd said she wouldn't be back until the next day, but there was a part of me that hoped it was all a misunderstanding, that she'd walk through the door any minute, laughing at my overactive imagination. But the clock ticked past midnight, and she didn't come home. I sat alone in the darkened living room, my phone in hand, debating whether or not to text her. Yet, somehow, I couldn't bring myself to do it. Instead, I sat there, letting the silence settle around me, wondering if I'd missed the signs all along. The next morning, I went through my usual routine, only to find that Rebecca's absence gnawed at me, leaving a hollow space I couldn't ignore. I busied myself with chores, anything to keep my mind off the gnawing feeling that something was deeply, fundamentally wrong. When she finally walked through the door in the early afternoon, I tried to keep my expression neutral. She looked exhausted, her hair disheveled, her clothes wrinkled. I forced a casual tone. "Good night out?" I asked, though every nerve in my body was on high alert. She hesitated, giving me that forced, distant smile again. "Yeah," she replied quickly, avoiding my gaze. "Just needed a bit of a break." I didn't push it. I simply watched as she went upstairs without so much as a second glance in my direction. That was when I noticed something strange. She didn't take her overnight bag with her. She just tossed it onto the armchair, as if it no longer mattered. I waited until I heard the shower running, then approached the bag cautiously, my heart pounding. I didn't know what I was looking for, but some force beyond reason compelled me. I unzipped it, feeling like I was violating some unspoken rule, but what I found inside made my stomach turn. Her perfume, makeup, and a change of clothes were all neatly packed, but tucked underneath was something that froze me on the spot, a small, expensive bottle of cologne I'd never seen her wear before. My hands shook as I zipped the bag back up, making sure everything looked undisturbed. I sank back into the chair, my mind racing. That cologne wasn't for me, and Rebecca didn't wear men's fragrances. It was a painfully clear clue that she hadn't spent the night alone. I felt a flash of anger, then a wave of numbness. Somehow, I kept my composure, but a part of me had already begun slipping away. That night, as I lay next to her in bed, I stared up at the ceiling, feeling the weight of her betrayal, even though I had no proof yet. Days passed, but the uneasy feeling lodged itself in my gut and refused to leave. I became hyper-aware of every interaction, every time she came home late or reached for her phone with a sudden urgency. My mind began constructing a narrative I hadn't wanted to consider before, one where her girls' nights and work dinners were simply a cover. One evening, while we were both sitting on the couch, her phone buzzed. She tensed, glancing at it with a quick flicker of apprehension. In that moment, everything I'd been bottling up since that first morning bubbled over. "Who's texting you so late?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. She looked up, surprised, and her face flushed a shade too quickly. "Just a friend from work," she muttered, swiping away the notification. She laughed awkwardly. "You're being paranoid." It was like a dam broke inside me. "Am I?" I challenged, unable to keep the bitterness from my tone. "Because it feels like you're hiding something." She fell silent, her eyes darting away from mine. That was all I needed. Without another word, I got up and walked out of the room, leaving her alone with her guilt. That night, I lay in bed, wrestling with what to do. Part of me wanted to confront her head-on, to demand an explanation. But another part of me, the rational side, told me that I needed proof. I wasn't going to throw away years of marriage on suspicion alone. So I waited, biding my time, watching her every move. The days turned into weeks, and each small slip only deepened my resolve. She'd started staying out more often, coming home with flimsy excuses and hollow apologies. I could see the guilt creeping into her face, though she tried to hide it. I could feel the distance growing between us like a shadow, an unspoken tension neither of us acknowledged. I went through her phone once, just to check. It was unlocked, left carelessly on the kitchen counter. But when I scrolled through, there was nothing incriminating, just work emails, group chats, and messages with friends. If she was hiding something, she was careful, almost too careful. Still, my gut told me that her careful facade was just that, a performance designed to mask the truth. So, I played along. I smiled, nodded, and pretended everything was fine, but inside, I was seething. I became an actor in our own marriage, feigning ignorance while I gathered every piece of evidence, every small inconsistency, and tucked it away. I was biding my time, waiting for the right moment, because when the truth finally came to light, I wanted there to be no room for doubt. Each passing day, her lies only fueled my resolve. She might have thought she could get away with it, but I knew that sooner or later, her web would unravel. And when it did, I would be ready. My patience was beginning to wear thin, but I held on. I spent most of my days with a dull ache in my chest, a quiet, relentless anger that made everything else seem trivial. I went to work, came home, shared silent dinners with Rebecca, and went to bed, lying beside her in the dark, pretending that our lives hadn't changed. But every time she left without an explanation or brushed off my questions, the anger simmered hotter. One evening, the opportunity I'd been waiting for came. She'd left her phone on the kitchen counter again, in a hurry to get ready for another one of her nights out. I knew her routine now. She'd rush around the bedroom and bathroom for a solid 15 minutes, giving me a short window to act. I'd grown too familiar with this script. I glanced at her phone, then quickly typed in her passcode. It was still the same, my birthday. The irony wasn't lost on me. The screen lit up, and I took a deep breath as I scrolled through her messages, my heart pounding. But just like before, the usual conversations with friends and colleagues filled her chat history. I almost set the phone down, thinking she'd covered her tracks yet again, but something made me look closer. Buried beneath a group of recent texts was a messaging app I'd never noticed before. It wasn't one she typically used, in fact, it was one I didn't even recognize. My thumb hovered over the app's icon for a moment before I opened it. My stomach dropped as I read the messages that immediately filled the screen. There, under the name Kevin, were dozens of texts, each one driving a stake further into my gut. "Friday night sounds perfect, can't wait to see you," one read. "Missed you last weekend, thought about you all night," said another. My blood ran cold as I read each message, a perfect echo of the fears I'd kept bottled up. Here was my proof, the dark truth she'd been hiding behind her carefully constructed lies. I'd been waiting for this moment, preparing myself for it, but the shock and betrayal still hit me like a punch to the stomach. In the texts, they'd made plans for a weekend getaway in a couple of weeks. My hand shook as I scrolled through, piecing together their plans, which seemed more elaborate than the simple nights out she'd been claiming. My heart twisted painfully as I read a message she'd sent just that morning: "I'll tell him I'm working, don't worry. Can't wait to be with you, really need to escape all this." Escape? From what? From me, from our life together. It was as if I were reading the words of a stranger. I snapped a few quick pictures of the messages, knowing I'd need them as evidence. Then I closed the app, taking a few deep breaths to steady myself. I could hear her still in the bathroom, humming to herself, oblivious. She returned to the kitchen, all smiles, her lips painted a deep red, a new shade I'd never seen her wear before. "Heading out?" I asked, my voice steadier than I'd expected. She glanced at me and nodded, brushing her hair over her shoulder. "Yeah, just a quick drink with the girls." "I won't be late," she said, flashing me a quick, empty smile. I nodded, watching her intently. "All right. Have a good time," I replied, forcing a calmness I didn't feel. She turned, heading toward the door, and I noticed her hand tighten around the strap of her purse, a small, nervous gesture she thought I hadn't caught. I wanted to scream at her, to demand an explanation, but I knew now wasn't the time. I needed to be smart about this. As the door clicked shut behind her, I sat down, the silence in the house pressing in on me. I had the proof I needed, but what came next? I considered confronting her, laying out her lies one by one, but part of me wanted something more, deliberate. She'd taken my trust and twisted it, used my own faith in her to cover her deception. If I was going to confront her, it wasn't going to be in the heat of the moment. No, she deserved something more profound, a reminder that actions have consequences. A plan began forming in my mind, one that would take time and careful execution. I decided to wait until their getaway. That weekend, when she thought she'd successfully duped me and left for her affair, I'd take everything apart piece by piece. Every comfort she'd taken for granted, every lie she told me, I would dismantle it all. The days leading up to that weekend were painfully surreal. I carried on with our usual routine, even feigned interest when she shared her vague plans for work on the upcoming weekend. I felt detached, like I was observing our marriage from the outside, seeing every crack and flaw I'd been blind to before. Each morning, I'd catch myself studying her, wondering how she could lie so easily, how she could look at me without an ounce of remorse. The Friday of their planned weekend finally came. She'd told me the day before that she'd be out of town for a work conference, some last-minute thing that couldn't be rescheduled. I acted as though I believed her, nodding along, even offering to help with her packing. I wanted to laugh at the ease with which she accepted my support, as though nothing had changed. That morning, I watched her pack her bags, folding her clothes carefully. I noticed she packed a set of lingerie I hadn't seen her wear in years, along with a dress I didn't even know she owned. It was almost laughable how little effort she made to hide the truth, as though I were too blind to see it. As she zipped up her bag, she turned to me with a small smile. "I'll be back late Sunday night," she said, her tone breezy. "Don't wait up." "Of course," I replied smoothly, forcing myself to return her smile. "Have a good trip." She kissed me on the cheek, her lips lingering a little longer than usual, as though she were trying to play the part of the devoted wife one last time. I held my breath as she walked out the door, and as soon as I heard her car pull out of the driveway, I got to work. I'd spent the previous week preparing everything, making sure I knew exactly what I needed to do. First, I called her parents, telling them that we'd decided to spend the weekend apart to think about our relationship. I didn't tell them why. I wanted that revelation to come later, in her own words. Next, I drafted an email to her close friends and family, explaining in a calm, straightforward tone that Rebecca had chosen to end our marriage. I didn't mention her affair directly, but the message was clear enough. Finally, I packed up a few of her belongings, just enough to let her know that things were serious. I took down her favorite photos from the walls, put away the small trinkets she'd scattered around the house, anything that would remind her that she no longer had a place here. By the time Saturday morning came, the house was transformed. It felt cold, empty, stripped of everything that had once made it ours. I sat on the couch, surrounded by the hollow echo of my own betrayal, feeling a strange sense of calm. The plan was in motion, and there was no turning back. Late that night, I received a text from her, a simple, "I'm thinking of you. Miss you." The hypocrisy of it made my blood boil, but I ignored it. Let her think I was still clueless. The reality she'd returned to would be enough to break through her facade. Sunday afternoon finally arrived, and I heard her car pulling into the driveway. I sat in the living room, waiting, my heart pounding with a mixture of anger and anticipation. The door opened, and I heard her footsteps falter as she took in the scene, the missing photos, the boxes by the door, the bare walls. I could almost feel the shock radiating from her. She stepped into the living room, her face pale, her eyes wide with confusion. What happened?" she stammered, looking around as though she'd walked into a stranger's home. I met her gaze, my expression calm. "Rebecca, we need to talk." Her face went even paler, her mouth opening slightly, and for the first time, I saw genuine fear in her eyes. She knew, in that moment, that her carefully woven lies had unraveled, that her betrayal was laid bare for me to see. The power had shifted, and I was ready to make her feel every ounce of the pain she'd caused. Rebecca stood frozen in the doorway, her face a mask of shock as she took in the bare, stripped-down room that had once been a reflection of us. Her gaze darted around, landing on the empty spaces where her photos had hung, the packed boxes, and the conspicuous lack of her belongings in every corner. It was a calculated move on my part, a silent message that she no longer belonged here. She opened her mouth to say something, but no words came. Instead, she just stared, her eyes wide with disbelief. I took a steadying breath, rising from the couch with a sense of calm I hadn't felt in months. I'd thought about this moment, rehearsed it in my mind, but now, standing here with her, I felt a dark satisfaction in watching her perfect little world begin to crumble. "Rebecca," I said, my voice calm and steady, "I think it's time we had an honest conversation." She blinked, snapping out of her stunned silence, and forced a smile that looked painfully out of place. "An honest conversation," she repeated, her voice wavering slightly. "Why does it look like you've been packing my things?" "Because I have," I replied, my tone clipped. "It's time you leave, Rebecca. I think you've overstayed your welcome." Her face drained of color as she grasped the meaning behind my words. "What are you talking about?" She laughed, but it was hollow. "Is this some kind of joke?" "No joke." I held up my phone and tapped the screen, showing her the text she'd sent to Kevin. I watched her face shift from confusion to horror as she recognized the messages, realizing there was no point in denying what was now glaringly obvious. "This has been going on for months, hasn't it?" She took a shaky step back, one hand covering her mouth. I don't know what you think you saw," she stammered, trying to muster a shred of defense, but it was weak, and we both knew it. "Let's not insult each other's intelligence, Rebecca," I interrupted, my voice low and firm. "You've been lying to me, and I've been patient. I've given you every opportunity to be honest, but you chose not to." I watched her face as the weight of her deceit settled in, her eyes darting around as if looking for an escape. But there was none. She took a deep breath, the mask slipping away, replaced by something closer to resignation. Fine, she said, crossing her arms. I made a mistake, okay? I was. I was lonely, and you were always so busy, wrapped up in work, ignoring me. Oh, don't even try that, I shot back, my voice hardening. Don't you dare turn this around on me. I was busy because I was working for us, for our future. And all this time, you were sneaking around behind my back with him. She looked away, biting her lip, and for a moment, the only sound in the room was the ticking of the wall clock. She was searching for something to say, some excuse that would lessen the blow, but I wasn't about to let her off so easily. You don't get to rewrite this story, Rebecca, I continued, unable to mask the anger simmering beneath the surface. You chose him. You chose to lie, to betray everything we built together. She closed her eyes, her shoulders slumping in defeat. I never wanted to hurt you, she murmured, her voice barely a whisper. It wasn't supposed to go this far. I thought it was just a phase. A phase? I repeated, incredulous. You call months of lying to me a phase? Don't insult me. I could see her struggling, caught between guilt and anger, wrestling with the weight of her actions. Finally, she let out a long, shaky breath, and the defenses dropped completely. You're right, she admitted. I messed up. I was selfish. But, please, just give me a chance to explain. I leaned back, crossing my arms. By all means, I said, my voice cold. Explain. She looked down, fidgeting with her hands, as though collecting her thoughts. It started as something small, something I thought I could control. Kevin was attentive. He made me feel important, like I mattered, she said, her voice quiet. And I guess I got lost in it. I didn't plan on it going this far. I thought I could keep it separate from us. Her words stung, the excuses she offered almost laughable. Separate? How, exactly, did you imagine that would work? I don't know, she admitted, her voice breaking. I didn't think. I didn't want to lose you, but I couldn't stop seeing him. I felt trapped. I laughed bitterly, shaking my head. Trapped? That's the word you're going with? Because if anyone here feels trapped, it's me. Trapped in a marriage with someone who doesn't know the first thing about loyalty. Tears welled in her eyes, and for a moment, I thought she might break down. But then, to my surprise, she straightened, her expression hardening. Fine. If you want me to leave, I will, she said, her voice shaking with barely controlled anger. But don't think you're innocent in this, either. You shut me out, made me feel like a ghost in this house. So that's it? I replied, my tone sharp. You think that justifies what you did? No, but it's not all my fault, she snapped, her face flushed with anger. You were so busy being the perfect husband, so focused on everything else, that you didn't even notice when I started slipping away. There was a bitter irony in her words, as though she genuinely believed her betrayal was something we both shared responsibility for. I shook my head, feeling the last remnants of my patience evaporate. No, Rebecca. I don't buy that. You made this choice, and now you're dealing with the consequences. She took a deep breath, wiping a stray tear from her cheek, and for a moment, she looked almost vulnerable. Is that it, then? She asked quietly. After everything, are you really going to throw this all away? Throw it away. I repeated, my voice growing louder. You already threw it away, Rebecca. You made your choice the minute you decided to lie, to sneak around. I gave you everything, and this is what you decided was worth risking it all for. She stood there, the fight draining out of her, and I could see the full weight of her actions settling on her shoulders. She didn't try to argue anymore, didn't offer any more excuses. She just looked down, defeated. So, what now? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I took a steadying breath, my mind made up. Now, you leave, I said firmly. There's no place for you here anymore. A pained expression crossed her face, and for a moment, I thought she might try to argue, to beg for a second chance. But instead, she simply nodded, her hands trembling as she reached for her bag. She glanced around the room one last time, her eyes lingering on the empty walls, the stripped-down space that had once been filled with memories of us. As she reached the doorway, she turned back, her face etched with regret. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice breaking. "For everything." I didn't reply. I simply watched as she walked out of the door, closing it softly behind her. I stood there in the silence, my heart heavy with a mixture of relief and sorrow, feeling the weight of our shattered marriage settle around me. For a long time, I didn't move. I just stood there, staring at the closed door, wondering how everything had unraveled so quickly. There was a hollow ache in my chest, a lingering sadness that I knew would take time to heal. But beneath it all was a sense of finality, a strange, liberating feeling that I hadn't expected. It was over. The lies, the deception, the constant second-guessing, all of it had come to an end. She was gone, and I was free to rebuild, to move forward without the weight of betrayal hanging over me. As the evening faded into night, I sat alone in the living room, surrounded by the remnants of our life together, feeling the emptiness settle in. I knew there would be days ahead filled with anger, sadness, maybe even moments of regret. But for now, I was content to sit in the silence, letting the reality of my new life sink in. In the quiet, I allowed myself a small, bitter smile. This wasn't how I'd imagined it ending, but maybe, in a way, it was the ending I needed. The days following Rebecca's departure were filled with a strange sense of peace and loneliness that took me by surprise. I'd thought that the silence would crush me, that being alone in the house we'd shared would be unbearable. But in many ways, the quiet was a relief. I didn't have to question every word, dissect every look, or wonder what lie might be hiding in the next room. The air in the house felt lighter. I returned to my routines, although they felt foreign without her. Work kept me busy, and on the weekends, I'd drive out to the coast or meet up with friends, filling my days to avoid the emptiness that lingered in the quiet. People asked me about Rebecca, and I kept my answers short, preferring not to let them in on the turmoil of the past few months. One evening, as I was settling in with a beer and some old movies, my phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number. I ignored it at first, but it buzzed again, flashing the number across the screen. I picked it up, curious. "Hello?" There was silence on the other end, and then a deep breath. "It's me," came Rebecca's voice, soft and uncertain. I hadn't expected this call. I hadn't expected to hear her voice ever again, actually. "What do you want?" I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. I know I don't have the right to ask for anything from you," she began, and I could hear the tension in her voice. "But I needed to talk to you. There's something you need to know." I felt a pang of irritation, of anger, but also a morbid curiosity. "All right," I said after a long pause. "What is it?" I didn't tell you everything," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't tell you the truth about Kevin." I let out a humorless laugh. "Well, that much I figured, Rebecca." "No," she continued, and there was something about her tone that stopped me. "I mean, I lied about who he was. Kevin wasn't some fling I met at work. He was," she trailed off, her words thick with emotion. "Just say it, Rebecca. What difference does it make now?" I snapped, the frustration spilling over. "He was someone I knew a long time ago. Before I met you," she confessed, and I could hear her struggling to find the right words. "We were together, years ago, before you and I ever met. And he's back now. That's why I went to him. It wasn't just because of us." I processed her words in silence, feeling a strange mixture of anger and shock. "You mean to say that the man you risked our marriage for was someone you already knew?" Someone from your past. Yes, she whispered, her voice breaking. It was stupid and selfish, and I wasn't thinking clearly. But there's more, and that's why I needed to talk to you. I didn't answer, but she took my silence as permission to continue. I'm pregnant, she said finally, the words like a bombshell over the phone. And I don't know if it's his, or yours. A wave of nausea swept over me, and I gripped the phone tighter. You're telling me, you could be carrying his child? The words tasted bitter, and I could barely get them out. I don't know, okay, she cried, her voice shaking. I just found out. And I needed you to know because if it is yours, you deserve to know. My mind was reeling, struggling to absorb the implications of her words. If the child was his, then she would have to live with that betrayal, the consequences of her actions. But if it was mine, suddenly, the anger I'd been holding onto so fiercely felt different, like a weight I couldn't shake. Why are you telling me this now? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Because I didn't want you to hear it from someone else, she replied softly. And because, if there's even the slightest chance it's yours, I didn't want to cut you out. I can't just pretend this never happened. There was a long silence as I tried to process everything she'd said, to make sense of this twist in the story I thought I knew. Rebecca, I said finally, my voice cold and controlled, you've taken so much from me. My trust, my peace, my dignity, and now you might be telling me that you're carrying my child. Do you know what that does to me? I know, she whispered, her voice thick with guilt. I know I hurt you, and I can never make up for it. But I needed you to know. And if you want to be part of this, of the baby's life, then I'll let you decide. My hand was shaking, and I took a deep breath, steadying myself. I need time, I replied quietly. I need time to think about this, to figure out what I want, if I want anything to do with you or the baby. I understand, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Take all the time you need. The line went silent, and I sat there, staring at the phone, feeling the full weight of her words pressing down on me. A part of me wanted to close the door on this chapter, to sever every tie and walk away from the mess she'd made. But another part of me, a part I'd kept buried beneath the anger, felt a strange tug at the thought of the child, my child, maybe, growing up without knowing me. In the days that followed, I went back and forth, battling the urge to forget her call and the growing sense of responsibility gnawing at me. I spent hours lost in thought, thinking of the life that might be, of the father I could become. I could still feel the anger, the bitterness at what she'd done, but beneath it, there was a flicker of something else. A week later, I found myself standing in front of a small, unassuming clinic. I'd decided to meet her here, to hear her out, to face the decision in person. Rebecca was waiting for me, her face drawn and pale, but she managed a small, hopeful smile when she saw me. She looked different, vulnerable in a way I hadn't seen before, and for a moment, I almost forgot the pain she'd caused. We walked in together, signing the necessary forms, and soon after, we were seated in a small room, waiting. The minutes ticked by, filled with the quiet hum of machines, the smell of antiseptic, and the tension between us. Neither of us spoke, the weight of what was coming too heavy for words. When the doctor finally entered, she greeted us with a kind, professional smile, explaining the process. It was straightforward enough, a paternity test, a few days to wait, and then the results would be in. Rebecca and I exchanged a tense glance, and I saw the fear in her eyes. After a quick swab and a few signatures, the doctor excused herself, leaving us alone in the room. Rebecca turned to me, her face filled with a mixture of guilt and sadness. "Thank you for coming," she said quietly. I looked at her, feeling the complexity of my emotions swirl together, anger and sorrow mixing with a faint sense of closure. "I'm here because if that child is mine, then I'll do what's right," I replied, my voice firm. "But this doesn't change anything between us, Rebecca. What you did, that doesn't just go away. She nodded, her eyes glistening with tears. I know. And I'm so sorry, for everything. I left the clinic feeling numb, the gravity of the situation pressing down on me. There was a long road ahead, one that I hadn't anticipated, and I didn't know where it would lead. But as I walked out into the fading sunlight, a strange sense of acceptance began to settle in. Whatever the future held, I knew one thing for sure: I would face it, head on, and I would make it through, with or without her.